All right, welcome to Jeremy Davis, Director of Cecil, here for the SLCEcast. Jeremy, how are you doing?
Great.
How's uh how's things shifting for the phases here and things in the union? How's that picking up?
We are rolling into phase three. The union is slowly gathering more people inside of it, and we're getting some reservations for different events to happen there. But I think it's going to be a gradual move to have more people and start engaging again. But with Cecil, we got a lot of rad things happening already. A number of
Yeah.
different virtual offerings, and now we're starting to do some in-person ones too.
Yeah, so why don't you take a minute to introduce yourself and what your role is, and then explain what Cecil is, because we've now both used it, but maybe folks don't know what the acronym is. So let's get into that.
I was kind of wondering about that. I was like, wow, you just jumped right into that acronym. Well, my name is Jeremy Davis. I'm the director for the Center for Student Involvement and Leadership. We affectionately call it CECL and just kind of pronounce it with those four letters. It's a merging of a number of different student involvement and engagement offices here at UW, about 10 different offices, and kind of brings them together to integrate the student experience too. So a student is not just seen as a leader in one space or a participant in one space, but a number of these different experiences come together. Sometimes we collaborate as offices to combine resources and kind of inform different experiences in different ways. So it's a pretty neat operation, I would say.
Yeah, as one of the folks that's seen kind of both sides of how the union was set up, it is really great for having these different offices work together. There's been things that we've been able to do, since coming together as Cecil that didn't really happen before. So like right now, I'm working really closely with ASUW on Pokes Vote stuff. So it is great to have that kind of relationship built between these offices because we are all kind of doing different flavors of the same thing at the end of the day for students. How did you wind up at UW? So give us a little kind of the brief overview walkthrough. I don't want to put you through an interview or like a job interview, but because this is an interview, I guess. But maybe just kind of a quick overview of some of the other things you've done before winding up here.
Okay, I was about to tell you my life story, but now I got to cut it short.
Now you have to censor, yeah.
I've been working in higher education for, I don't know, 15 or more years now. And it's primarily been in the out of classroom experiences. We often refer to that as student affairs. So I got my start as an RA. I worked in housing for a number of years, associate director, doing a variety of different things. And a couple of years ago, I made the switch over to what sometimes is called student life. So a number of different experiences and activities that student can engage in that's outside of the residence and also outside of the classroom. And so I was working, I don't know, a couple of years ago down the road at a neighboring institution, and I saw this job come open. And I was just like, oh, so many things in that job. It looks so awesome. I get to work with student media and student government and clubs and organizations and service organizations. And it's just incredibly dynamic. And UW also kind of caught my eye because it's such a gorgeous campus in a rugged outdoor kind of setting. And that definitely fits for my lifestyle. I've actually got some climbing gear hanging in the background right now.
Ready to go. As soon as we get done, you go climb something?
Wish. I've been working on some budgets lately. I don't think that's going to happen. But
yeah, it's that season. And
cool job, cool location. Very eager to make a difference in the student experience for UW students. So
I can't imagine how differently your job is, probably day to day, but also hour to hour. Because sometimes, I feel like that, and I'm within one office that you're overseeing a bunch of them. Do you have any interesting examples of like the biggest turnaround between two tasks you were dealing with or something? Or like all of a sudden, I'm dealing with this issue, and then who knew the next day it's going to be this instead? Anything come to mind?
I have a lot of stories. I'm going to try and find some that are amusing and a little appropriate. So, working in the union, we have, and sharing responsibility for that facility as a student engagement space, there's a lot of things that interrupt your day. So I could be working on like budgets like I am today. I could be working on policy. But the more fun things are kind of interacting with students. So um, I help lead this student engagement council that we have for student leaders, which is pretty neat. We haven't activated it this year just because of COVID, but it's a good resource for student leaders. But I could be doing something like that, interacting with folks or going to a program. But like the things that always make me giggle a little bit are the things that happen in the building. So
Mhm.
sometimes someone will come running into my office and be like, a dog pooped in the hallway. And so like we have to like figure out how are we going to deal with that. Or in like the heavy rains that happen in the summer, we have this weird elevator sitch where like the water can come down the loading dock, down an elevator shaft, and then back up into the building. And so sometimes we have this like weird reverse flooding that happens. And so we'll like rally people with squeegees and mops to try and address those things. So it's really a combination of a number of different things.
Yeah, I'm sure it's just got to be a little bit of everything. And right, and now, right,
Yeah,
now it's always something different for everybody every day. Um, so I want to get into talking about why I invited you here, and that starts with your dissertation that you've been working on, your doctorate that you've been working on. So give folks that don't know a little background there first, and then we can dive into that.
sure. I've been a doctoral student for maybe like 7 years, 6 years now, and I am like this close to finishing. So this week, actually, I'm going to hit the send button to my advisor and send off my
Oh,
dissertation.
nice.
A, I don't know, 200-page plus document that gets actually into student leadership. So having some background and experience in student leadership, I thought it would be a neat topic to explore, but I've also been fascinated and heavily involved in identity work, especially with social justice activism. So in previous roles, I've facilitated workshops that explore identity and the meaning of various identities for students, staff, and faculty. And I thought that it would be interesting to examine leadership by looking at social identity. So a number of years ago, like maybe 4 years ago, there was a report that came out from the leadership education field, identifying some really important areas that need development in leadership development. And so social identity was one of the most important things that was like at the top of the list. They signaled that we have to understand ourselves as leaders, and part of that is understanding your social identities in order to be an effective leader and lead in an increasingly diverse society. So I thought about like examining what student leadership might look like with certain social identities, how those identities influence students' leadership styles. And the one that I thought was probably the less touched upon was race. And right now, race has reemerged as a very salient topic amongst many in this country. And I didn't intentionally pick it because of that. It just kind of came out that way. But I thought in many different ways of examining race. There's some neat emerging models about student development and leadership as it pertains to underrepresented racial groups within the university and within universities across the country. And so I thought it might be neat to look at kind of that other side of it, like how oftentimes we talk about race, but we don't really talk about what it means to be white
Mm-hmm.
and a
Yep.
leader. It's just kind of assumed that white is associated with normalcy, which is incredibly problematic and often one of the biggest barriers in discussing race. But in that, we sometimes don't look at what it means to be a white leader, a white student leader in particular, and what kind of privileges are associated with that dynamic, and how do you navigate those as a student leader. So my dissertation was all about digging into what it means to be a white student leader and how students can make meaning of their racial privilege and also their leadership identity at the same time.
Did anything change for you this summer? Were you looking at pieces maybe that you had already written and thought were done that you felt like you'd have to go back and revisit? Just like you said, having race come up as a salient topic, nationwide and worldwide.
The study that I conducted, I met with student leaders 3 times in the course of it for more than an hour each in a group setting. And so we unpacked concepts together, and just an hour's worth of dialogue in one meeting was so incredibly rich that oftentimes I spent weeks unpacking what those research meetings held. And so I actually, like, the additional stuff that was happening this summer with unrest, uh, it wasn't needed. There was so much that was in there, and some of the students in that study actually talked about racial protests and unrest that was happening, and that was before some of the more prominent Black Lives Matters movement stuff happened across the country. And so it's kind of interesting that these students were already thinking about it before it hit a national scene.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It is an interesting spot for those of us. We were doing this work 6 months ago, 6 years ago. So for all of a sudden, it just puts a whole new lens, I think, on what we do, and it's it's still kind of early in the semester to really see a lot, but I suspect that we're probably going to get students getting involved with the kind of programs around those topics that we might not have seen a year ago, and I think that's awesome. I'm hoping that that's at least what comes from this.
I agree.
So tell us a little bit about, let's maybe drill down a little more into kind of specifically what you were looking for, or specifically what you found, depending on, I guess you know more about the research or what came out of it than I do. So whichever one of those makes more sense to talk about, let's start there.
I'll try not to get too nerdy about research because I actually love research. And this was a qualitative study. So the thing about qualitative studies is you interview people, you talk about them, you learn about their lived experiences. And in that, it's not meant to be generalizable. So the thought is that this might inform how you think about these issues and how you might come up with solutions for, racial inequity. But it's not meant to be like blanketly applied, because these students experience this, all students must experience that. So with that disclaimer, what I will say that I found is that the student leaders that I met with were really quick and to identify where their racial privilege existed in being a student leader. They were like, yeah, like white privilege right there. And what about this in the university? And what about this about our national government? But they're much more reluctant to make the connections within themselves and their personal experiences. And so that's very understandable and naturally challenging to have that vulnerability to be like, yeah, I've never thought about race when I got this position that I'm in right now. I never had to think, did it benefit me? Did it not benefit me? Like, how did it compare to my peers? I just didn't think about it. And it's harder to have those conversations when it comes to like digging deep into your racial privilege. And that was one of the things that was uncovered in this study, but it's common sense, it makes sense. And so I think vulnerability is key when it comes to talking about both leadership, but especially racial privilege, white privilege in a student leadership context. And if you can establish that, then you can start to build trust and like candid conversations around what it really means to be a white individual. So another thing that one of the students talked about in this group that I had was they were worried that if they admitted to thinking about these things, to be like, ooh, is that a racist thought? How do I address that in myself? They admitted that to a peer, they felt like they might be compromised within their peer group and branded as racist. But we all live within a society that is essentially racist. There are different benefits that are provided to white individuals than people of color. And we can understand this through empirical study, but we're like hard to acknowledge that in ourselves. Like it's such a challenge. And these students felt the fear of being able to ask if they could talk about this with a peer. And so finding a group of people like we had in our research study was one of the conclusions that I talked about, is that is so critical to being able to unpack some of your social identities, is being with people who are of a similar identity, but also a similar mindset to where you can understand what those things mean. And so that was some of the basis of the research that I did, is that it was intended to be a single identity group. So everybody had to identify as white in order to participate in it. That way we could unpack what it meant to be white. And with that, there's some benefit to that, because there's a lot of research out there that says that oftentimes people, when they seek to learn about white privilege, especially white people, they rely on their friends, colleagues, teachers of color to do that. And by asking people to recount some of the terrible things they've experienced as a person of color is traumatic just for the learning of someone who might be white. And so this model actually is a more socially responsible way for leaders to be able to develop racial awareness around their privileged identity, and also find a place where they're trusted amongst peers. So that was one of the findings that I talked about, is how to find those spaces. Who can encourage you to find them? Who can connect you on a college campus? And kind of unpacking some of that, giving guidance to both white student leaders and also student affairs professionals.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's an interesting thing, like you mentioned at the beginning, that you found kind of an angle that you felt like hadn't really been looked at before, and I think that comes from leadership programs for a long time were geared for white students, right?
Yep.
Like that's what it was, and that's true of most things in higher ed, right? Is they were geared for a specific audience because that's where it came from, and that history lived on for a very long time. And then as they shifted focus to being mindfully inclusive, I think the conversations that were around race were focused on those that were newly included, right? So non-white folks that were, specific leadership programs were developed for, and on, other different ways there, to where, that normalcy had been so centered, or that, I guess I should say, being framed as normalcy, because it shouldn't, I don't think, just be normalcy, had been so centered that, there wasn't a stop and reflection of, okay, how does this identity fit here? Because it's not just a default or a kind of blank canvas that it sometimes gets looked at through. I'm curious if you found or saw kind of resistance to that at all, or maybe I don't know, a dissertation advisor that's like, oh, we need to clarify a little more. I don't know what it'd be, but were there any kind of roadblocks to trying to look at it that way?
Most certainly. Even in my recruitment, when I was meeting with student leadership groups, I had folks who were like, well, when are you going to have the group with students of color, or with Latinx students, and I had to kind of preface it with some of the things that you just mentioned. Like, there are many emergent models that have developed, but the models that were created on white student leaders, problematically many years ago, haven't developed or progressed beyond what they originally intended. And that omission is kind of another version of white privilege.
Yeah.
It's just the white privilege in leadership development. So it's like, you don't have to learn how your culture, how your race interfaces with your leadership because you are white. And so having those conversations is a little bit challenging with students who are developmentally at different places with understanding their own identity. And first of all, with a dissertation, like, I wrote 200 pages just on this topic. Like, if I had different groups, it would be like a 600-page document. You have to keep the focus really narrow and specific. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think there are opportunities to understand, for people of color and also specific racial identities, how their leadership influences it. And I've signaled that in my dissertation, that those are great places for further study. But I also got some folks in my recruitment where they were very insistent that I shouldn't study white students. And these recommendations were actually coming from white people. And to me, that is more suggestive of perhaps a defensive-ness. Like, what is there possibly to learn from white students? Or like, we're, in some ways it could be self-deprecating, like, we're nothing special. Like, this is considered normal. Why would you want to study this? But like, I think that also reinforces some of those notions of whiteness that can kind of insulate us from understanding who we truly are.
Yeah, for sure. Let's take back to Jeremy, the undergrad student, for a second. What do you think this process would have been like for you if you were one of those subjects?
Oh, good grief.
What was your own relationship with kind of race and identity when you were a student?
I never would have had the courage to participate in a study like this. Just being real, like, this has been decades worth of self-exploration in myself to be able to come to this point, to be able to do this dissertation. And I'm just amazed by the students who are voluntarily stepped forward and took a risk to be able to have these vulnerable conversations with other white student leaders that they may know across the campus where I did this study. And so um, I just, I'm amazed. I wouldn't have been like this. I remember the first time that a staff member on campus actually sat me down. It was like, hey, let's talk about this. Like,
Mhm.
you seem like you're interested in this. And I'm like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And they're like, what are you gonna do to educate yourself a little bit more or to take the next step when it comes to learning about your racial identity? And I was like, I was dumbfounded. Like, nobody had ever asked me that question. Nobody had ever asked me any question when it pertains to race. Like,
Yeah.
when did you first realize you were white? Or, like, what does it mean to be white? Or what comes along with being white? And in some ways, I had a similar experience with the students who were in the study. They're like, oh, never thought about that before.
Mhm.
So for me, it's been quite a journey. It did start in undergrad, but I'll be honest, like I thought I was a good person and that generally covered what it meant to know about my social identities. I'm like, I'm good. I don't need to
Yeah.
dig into myself any more than I already have. Oh, to be 18 again.
Yeah. Yeah. I
every
think,
year, every year I learn something new about myself that I don't know. And
yeah.
so I just, I encourage students to kind of take that risk.
Yeah. You just have to start doing it, right? Just start reading, start, signing up for something like this when you're asked, whatever, just start.
Yeah.
And if you're anything like me, you're going to look at your dissertation in 5 years and have kind of the same thought of like, oh, how did I miss this? It was so obvious, right? It's always growth. And I think that's good. Like that should be seen as a good thing if you can look back on past work and think it should be different instead of look back on it and think it's all the same. So you kind of talked about how, what led up to it or what got you there. What about next? As you're wrapping this up, are you thinking, oh boy, now I want to do this or that with this information or as the next step?
Yeah. So my advisor is already talking about how I'm going to turn it into a publication.
Mhm.
That sounds fun after just writing this document. But I think that is the logical next step when it comes to the generation of knowledge through research. Is that what's the purpose of it about writing about it if it's not being shared in meaningful ways with the
Mhm.
communities that you're seeking to serve? So there's a number of publications that could come from this, either regarding methods or findings. But I also, part of this research was funded through the um, Social Research, Social Justice Research Center on
Okay.
the UW campus. And that has some stipulations and requirements to it in that it asked that I present during the Shepherd Symposium on social justice. So kind of exciting. There'll be like a more comprehensive presentation as to what the dissertation found and some of the recommendations, hopefully in a couple months in April.
Cool. Cool. Um, Throughout this whole process, how did you reflect on your own leadership at the time? I know for me, teaching leadership in classes and stuff, I like it for kind of a selfish reason. On top of the just getting to see the light bulb go on for students, like that's enough. But let's put the icing on the cake and be selfish too. The selfish reason is it keeps me accountable. I feel like as a leader to be studying leadership or to be teaching leadership, and every time I'm faced with a tough decision, like I have a whole classroom full of students on my shoulder and I know I have to do what I would say to do in class. Right. So I'm curious if you've ever had the same thing there, or if there was anything in your own leadership that you recognized through the process that you're like, oh, I hadn't thought about that before.
Yeah, I think that good research is reflexive in that nature, and that
Hmm.
you're contributing in your own ways to the research, but the research is also affecting you too. And I tell you what, like there were some concepts that the students brought up that I was like, whoa, I had never considered anything like that before. And I reflected back on some of my like upbringing and my personal experiences, and I was like, yep, that was check. Like I totally did that. And thinking forward, I was thinking about like what are the ways that I could perhaps mitigate some of those things that cause harm to other people. But what I will say is that when you integrate research and what you do for a living in your professional setting, and hopefully that's what like I do, like you refer to that as praxis. It's the merging of research and practice together. And one of the things that I immediately notice is that I am more likely to engage people in conversations to initiate those conversations about what race means in a professional setting,
Mhm.
and also take the lead on it when it comes to facilitating dialogue. So after some of the racial injustice that came to national prominence this summer, I offered and suggested to be able to facilitate different groups to have conversations around some of that stuff. And so
Mhm.
a lot of us gathered our masks and went outside and had some real dialogue about what we were thinking and experiencing. And I think that those things probably wouldn't happen without my participation in this research. Like I might have participated in something like that, but I wouldn't have led that. And I
Yeah.
think that what I've found is an emboldenment of my leadership abilities when it comes to a professional setting.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a challenge getting students involved sometimes is students can be super ambitious. I think that they show up and they're like, okay, this is an issue. What do I do? And they're seeing that kind of in target goal kind of thing, or that's what they want to see maybe. But I think your point goes back to the idea of just start. Because if you're reading about these things, you're just naturally going to do something about it because you understand better what the issue is and what your role is in it. At least that's what I think about it.
And it sounds like from what you're talking about with leadership and racial awareness is that it's a process. It's not,
Mhm.
there's no end point. It's not
Right.
like, all right, I did the workshop, I got it, right?
Right.
But it's this constant thing that you never really fully give up in that way,
Yeah.
but you're always engaged and willing to engage in it.
I had a professor in my undergrad that always said, you graduate high school and you know everything. And you graduate undergrad and you know something. And then you go on and go to grad school and then you graduate realizing you know nothing. And I think that's true to a certain extent for a lot of things. But I think when it comes to thinking about racial and social justice and identity and all of those, that's just more so true. Like the more you learn about this, the less you're going to feel like you know.
Absolutely.
But that's what will motivate you to keep learning about it. Hopefully.
Yeah.
Let's talk about leadership just a little more generally,
Sure.
because there are so many different takes on what is good leadership. And if you Google it, you're going to get millions of book responses of everybody that's written a book on the topic or whatever. So I'm curious if there's a specific framework or author or theory or anything that really stands out to you that kind of guides your leadership.
So my leadership is somewhat based off of one of my favorite models, which is and I always jumble it up. I've got the book behind me too. The social change leadership model, leadership for social change.
Social change model for leadership development.
Something like that. Yeah.
There we go. We'll get it between one of us. We'll know one of these things.
I know. I feel like leadership has to serve a greater purpose than just personal or organizational advancement, but I think that it has to serve societal advancement. And that's one of the foundations as to why I work in student affairs and higher education, is to be able to make a contribution in many different ways, whether it's scholarly work, personal relationships, helping someone achieve their goals. I think that we have to be focused on positive change within society. And so that leadership model is probably one of my faves. I actually like reading even those like pop leadership texts. Like there are nuggets that you can pull from any framework. And so I find there's a lot of interesting models out there, but I'd say probably something focused on social responsibility and change. I also like Bowman and Deal. They have an idea of understanding organizations and leadership that's associated with it within 4 different frames.
Mhm.
And those are kind of cool too, because it unpacks some of the frames that we're less accustomed to. Oftentimes we think about leadership through terms of either HR or like supervisory leadership,
Hmm.
like a structural kind of thing, like hierarchy and such. But there are 2 other dimensions that I think are really neat to understand: a cultural dimension that involves like the symbolic elements of leadership. And oh, good grief, I'm forgetting what the 4th one was. Anyways, they're cool. There's 4 of
Yeah,
them.
and I think that's important. Any there's a few different models that kind of focus on looking at the same situation through multiple lenses, and I think that's always a valuable exercise. It is for me anyhow, especially when something goes wrong. You look back at it and go, which one of these did I miss? And usually you can find it pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Um, both things that you brought up and some of the other things you said, I feel like you center on leadership as a process that happens with a group of people.
Mm-hmm.
Much of the literature is leadership as the actions of a person, right? The leader is kind of centered, whereas in leadership, or as what you're talking about, the group is centered over the individual. And what I found is the majority of students that show up day one in a leadership class are wanting, what are the things I do as a leader, as an individual in that role to do it? And hopefully, if I've done my job right, by the end of class, we're talking about the relationship piece. How do we shift that focus even more? How do we get away from that old school kind of the great man kind of model of a leadership? A leader is a great person, and here's the things they do, to leadership as a process a group can do together.
Oof, that is a really good question. I think I can only offer pieces that might be helpful to it, but I think that examining the motivations as to why someone adheres to or adopts some of the more traditional leadership paradigms, where,
Mhm.
like you mentioned, like the great man, but a lot of folks who engage in leadership are initially motivated by that. They're looking
Mhm.
to further themselves, perhaps further their career or their socioeconomic status through leadership. And leadership is a vehicle for individual service. I think that when you start interacting in a group, there's a lot of models that actually kind of go into this about how not only can you examine your own values and your own leadership, but through the process of interacting with other people, the exposure and the social perspective taking, as they call it, and understanding what other people's values are and leadership styles are, you start to modify your own in your own kind of concurrent evaluation of yourself. And so I think really the key to that is exposure and focused on a collective sense of purpose. So what, as a group, are you working together, and how can different people contribute to that? Because if you think about leadership in terms of position or power, then sometimes you're lacking some of the other elements that leadership can organically come through. Like everybody can have a role in something. So I think that group work actually is pretty fundamental in understanding how you can shift away from that traditional sense of leadership.
Yeah, I don't have the answer either. I'm glad that I get to ask the questions.
That's
It's
your question.
yeah, I just want to ask instead of answer. Because yeah, it's tough. It's hard. We're dealing with hundreds of years, giving people a
Or,
certain way to think. Yeah, more, a lot
yeah.
more, a lot more. So it is interesting, but it feels like the entire field is shifting that way. And that I think all it takes is mentioning it to students, and then they go, "Oh yeah, okay." So it's not like a fight to get them to buy into that idea, but there's a lot of different things, and I think it's also interesting because maybe depending on what a student's involved with on campus, they might be learning about leadership in a multitude of different ways. So
Mhm.
whether they're in doing business related things, because there's a lot of business related leadership things. Maybe they're in ROTC, and it's military leadership's a whole different kind of spin. Or I know ag is doing a lot of leadership things, or they're an outdoor leadership minor, and then it's completely kind of off on its own by design, right? Like out in the middle of the woods. Um, what do you think? What do you think like runs between all these, or pulls them all together? Like, what's the kind of strand
Mm.
between all these different models, or all these different ways of teaching leadership.
Is there?
Maybe there's
I
not.
mean, like, yeah, like honestly, I asked that question. I think that different paradigms of our leadership are fundamentally different
Yeah.
for many reasons, and part of that is based in culture and what someone's worldview is. And so I think that there are some parallels that you can draw between industrial leadership theory and relational leadership models, but I think that they're fundamentally different for a reason, and that
Yeah.
um, they, for better or for worse, propagate culture and advance an organization in the way that they're used to.
Yeah. And I think that could be tough for students. Just that, here's a whole class about a topic, but no one's really sure exactly what that topic is or what the definition of that topic is, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's important. I think people new to leadership studies kind of take a while to get there sometimes. Is that self-reflection piece, and that ties right back to what you're looking at with identity. You have to know who you are before you can lead anybody. What would you say about that idea?
I think that's true, but it may not apply to all leadership paradigms. I do think that you have to understand yourself before you
Mhm.
can interact in a greater social context to be able to affect change. But I think that there are some leadership models that are squarely focused on positional power and other forms of power that perhaps don't resonate as much with understanding of self. But I think that perhaps that's the one thing that unifies many different forms of leadership, is that it's meant to serve an organization in some way. It's meant to advance things to where they need to go.
Yeah, and yeah, I think maybe then that fundamental element might just be, does everyone buy into the same idea?
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. So maybe we answered it. That's the thing that holds them together. Is it works for that group, which we can say
Yeah.
about anything we wanted to apply it to, it'd probably be right. So I'll just say that's the answer. um, what else? What have I not asked you about? What what was something that just came to mind that you were thinking you were going to talk about when I asked you to talk about your dissertation and this idea of identity and leadership?
I think that your questions are like right on point. Like some of these things are things that I've had to reflect about at towards the end of my dissertation. Is not just kind of like, okay, what have I observed with students, but what have I observed in myself? And that is really at the heart of what I believe leadership to be. I'm curious from you, Richard, who is a leadership role model for you? Who are you kind of like, or system, should I say? It doesn't have to be
Yeah.
a person per se, but what people kind of serve as inspiration to you for leadership?
Oh goodness. Models, the same one you mentioned. Obviously, I work in Slice. That should be a giveaway. Also for me, Kouzes and Posner.
Yeah, all right.
For folks not familiar, the book The Leadership Challenge, and it's essentially it's similar. I see it, or I use it similarly to the 4 frames, even though they don't necessarily describe it that way. Basically 5 things all leaders should be doing, and if you're doing these 5 things, you're probably on a pretty good track. And I like systemized things, as you probably kind of know.
Yeah.
I like that kind of structure and logical progression. And so having a list of saying, okay, here's your 5 things, check them off, go do them. That works well for me. But as individuals, I think the leaders that I'm more and more drawn to are ones you have to dig a little to find their name.
Okay.
So it's not always the former president or the sports person or the great explorer, all these people that, if you Google famous leaders, are probably going to come up on that list. I think it's a lot of folks in the activism world, people that just see a need and they just pull people together and start doing something about it, regardless of positionality or anything else.
Okay.
And that's what I don't aspire to any positional leadership. A lot of folks in my position are probably on a track, or at least they were at some point early in their career, to where they're thinking, I want to be a dean of students, or I want to be a vice president of student affairs. And that's the goal, right?
Yeah.
I'm not that person. I think you can do it. I shouldn't get into saying more or anything. I think you can be equally as effective as a leader from the middle of an organization as you can at the top.
Absolutely.
And I think if you are doing it in that position, you can get more and more people around you to maybe perform some leadership in the same way. Sounds weird to say perform leadership. I don't know a good phrase about do leadership. Lead. Maybe it's just lead. That's what it is. But yeah, so a lot of them are folks that I might just see one thing that they've done or something. So it's not like this whole career and resume of leaders, but see people that are just willing to step up and act in the moment, I think is one of the most kind of inspirational leadership stories that there is.
Right on.
My normal answer, though, when it's like a quick round the room thing, is I'll say Teddy Roosevelt, just so I can give you a name somewhere in that ramble. And that goes back to largely starting or participating in the start of the conservation movement in the national parks. Other things to protect consumers, basically from monopolies and those kind of pieces. And then you have to judge a leader in the context of their time, I think. Yeah. And I have to be open and look at all of the problematic things about somebody that would be president in the time period he was. And there were lots of horrible things around race and around other demographics, right? And so acknowledging that, I don't just want to throw his name out there and not say something about that. I think that's important. But that there were also some smaller things that he was doing to kind of advance the world in that way too. So I think given those kind of disclaimers, he's still one that kind of comes up again and again for me when I think about leadership, and just that stylistic piece. Yeah. The speak softly, carry a big stick. Yeah. Like you're never gonna hear me yell ever. But that doesn't mean I won't hold some feet to the fire and force some consequences when the time kind of comes. So that little piece has stuck with me quite a bit, I guess.
That's cool.
Other things you want to mention before we wrap up? I've kind of tried giving everybody a little bit of time to make a plug for anything going on or something like that. I know it's a little tougher when you're overseeing a whole bunch of different places rather than one specific office, but anything coming up that you want to point students' attention towards, or anything else you want to say that way?
Not anything in particular. We do have a lot going on right now. So that's the one thing that I will say is that if a student is seeking something right now, if they are bored or feeling disconnected, especially right now with COVID, I highly encourage that they reach out to someone like Richard or someone like me to find out about what's going on. There are a number of different things happening in virtual contexts if you're a little bit worried about interacting face-to-face, but we have some things in the works also for face-to-face interactions, and student organizations right now are starting to gear up as well. So there are a number of different things. So I think amid COVID, more now than ever, it's important to remain engaged and connected with fellow students. So let us know how we can help.
Yeah, totally. And that's the same message I've heard from all of our colleagues, is we're all sitting here waiting. Not just waiting, we're proactively doing some programming and stuff too, but there's not, I don't know a single person on campus that's going to turn you away if you reach out and are looking for something. So yeah, definitely do that. And it might be a little harder for students to find these opportunities right now. And that's because it's harder for us to figure out how to advertise them and get them to you. But there are things happening, and there's some really cool stuff happening that probably wouldn't have ever happened otherwise.
Absolutely.
So don't miss out on those. So the next virtual world hangout thing that we have, you can come be part of with us.
Yeah. I got some highlight reels from that, and I'm going to show them tomorrow night at the ASCNB meeting. So it's pretty neat.
Excellent. Cool. Well, Jeremy, thank you so much. This is a really, really interesting topic. maybe it's premature, but congratulations on wrapping it up. Or congratulations on being a lot closer than you were last time you and I talked about it. We'll say
I'll take
that.
it. I'll take it. Yeah, I defend on the 22nd of October.
Oh,
So,
so it's coming up.
mhm.
Cool, cool. Yeah, so thanks again for being here. Folks that want to contact Jeremy, I'll throw his email up on here just so you know how to get a hold of him. And we'll see what we have next week. So tune back in because I have no idea who it's going to be or what we're going to talk about, but it'll be good. All right. I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much.